Chapter 2, Atoms, Ions, and Molecules, Part 2. So, back to the periodic table. And again, one key thing to remember is that the way it is arranged leads to column 8 containing what are referred to as the noble gases. Noble because they are basically chemically inert. It is extremely difficult to get chemical reactions with helium, neon, argon, and so on. These are the chemically inert elements with their outermost shell completely full. And it turns out that all other elements want to be just like the noble gases. It's kind of like, the noble gases are like the Kardashians, right? Everybody wants to be like them. So elements that have only 1 or 2 electrons in their outermost shell tend to lose electrons. That means their outermost shell goes away, leaving behind a new outermost shell, the smaller one that has complete full number of electrons. The elements with a lot of electrons in their outermost shell tend to gain electrons. When they gain electrons, that will fill their outermost shell, making them chemically appearing similar to the noble gases. I'm sorry, I lied, not chemically, but making it structurally appear similar to the noble gases. And then other elements in the middle, they tend to share electrons with other elements, other atoms. And this is known as the octet rule because, again, the outermost shell has 8 max electrons, except for the first outermost shell having only 2. All right, when an element, an atom, gains or loses electrons, it no longer has the same number of electrons as protons, and this will give it a charge. So a positively charged atom has more protons than electrons. A negatively charged atom will have more electrons than protons. And things that are able to dissolve in water and produce ions are called electrolytes. So an electrolyte is a chemical, a molecule, or atom that, when dissolved in water, produces ions. And these ions can be extremely important physiologically. So, for instance, sodium ions, very important for electron signaling with the neurons in our brain and spinal cord. Calcium ions, very important for muscle contractions, blood clotting. Chloride ions, important for stomach acids. So electrolytes are very important for the function of the human body. When atoms associate stably, they form molecules. So a molecule is 2 or more atoms stably associated. 2 or more atoms stably associated. Now, a compound is 2 or more elements stably associated. So that means there's 2 or more different kinds of atoms. So this little Venn diagram here shows you have lots of things that are molecules, and some of those molecules are also compounds. So the selections here, we see that carbon dioxide and sodium chloride are both compounds as well as molecules, while oxygen and nitrogen, in the states that we normally find them in the atmosphere, are only molecules. So, ionic compounds. Ionic compounds are formed when atoms associate via the ionic bond. So what happens is you have oppositely charged ions that then interact and form the ionic bond, which is pretty stable. So for instance, here we have sodium atom with 1 electron in its outermost shell, chlorine atom with 7 electrons in its outermost shell. The sodium atom gives up its electron, the chlorine atom takes the electron. Now we have a positively charged sodium ion, a negatively charged chloride ion, and they associate, they form the ionic bond that now keeps them together molecularly. And when you look at lots of sodium chloride together, you see that they form a lattice crystal structure, which is pretty cool looking. And they're able to dissolve in water because of the charged nature of their ions. And so that means an ionic bond always leads to the formation of compounds because you're going to have 2 different elements in order for one to lose electrons and the other to gain those electrons. So here we have magnesium. We know there's 2 electrons in the outermost shell because it's in the second column. And so it will lose those 2 electrons to appear more like neon, and that could be written out as Mg2+. And if you're going to combine magnesium with Chlorine, you see chlorine over here in the 7th column. It has 7 electrons in the outermost shell, so it wants to gain 1 to become argon. So to cancel both positive charges on the magnesium, you'll need 2 chlorine atoms associated with the magnesium ion. So NgCl2 is the compound that would be formed. All right, we also have covalent bonds. Covalent bonds are when 2 or more atoms share electrons. They share the electrons, so they both still have association with those electrons, and so there's no net gain or loss of charge from a loss or gain of electrons because they're being shared. And these can lead to the formation of molecules or compounds. Some common molecules: hydrogen gas, H2, with a single bond between the hydrogen atoms; oxygen gas, O2, with a double bond, a sharing of 2 electrons between the oxygen atoms; and the nitrogen gas, N2, with a triple covalent bond between the 2 nitrogens, sharing 3 electrons. And this is actually how these gases are found in our atmosphere. Carbon is very important for living things, and carbon needs 4 electrons to satisfy the octet rule. It only has 4 electrons in its outermost shell, so it needs to share to acquire 4 more electrons. And it can do this by a variety of ways. It can, say, bond with 4 different hydrogen atoms, sharing 1 electron with each hydrogen atom. That would be methane, CH4. It could, say, double bond with 2 oxygen atoms, giving you carbon dioxide. And it can be even more complex, where carbon is associating with lots of different kinds of other elements. So here is ethanol, and you can see there's 2 carbons. One of them is associating with 3 hydrogens and another carbon, 2 single bonds. Another one associating with 2 hydrogens, an oxygen, and a carbon through single bonds as well. Carbon can form double bonds. I think there are some cases where carbon even forms triple bonds. Carbon skeleton. Carbon skeleton is a way to look at the structure of a compound that has lots of carbons in it. And a lot of our macromolecules, carbohydrates, proteins, and so on, have a lot of carbons within them. Carbons are very important for living things. So, say you could write it out showing the carbons with little dashes where it's attaching to other elements. And if no element is put in those spots, then that means it is bound to hydrogen, which is the most common thing for carbon to be bound to. And then you can also write it out as a line sort of structure, where you can see each point of the line is where a carbon is. And then you assume, of course, you have the additional hydrogen atoms that are needed. Here's the double bond we see here. And double bonds, it turns out, often bend the molecule. So you will see sort of what the shape is. This can be a branch-like structure, where the points of the branch would also count as a carbon. So it would be a carbon here going to this carbon H3, and then another carbon H3 attached to that carbon, as you see shown up here. And it can even form rings. So each point on this ring structure would be where a carbon is, and it would have hydrogens attached to it. So glucose, for example, is a very important sugar, very important carbohydrate, and it has 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens. That should say oxygen on this slide. That is a typo. So 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, 6 oxygens. But it also turns out galactose and fructose, other simple sugars, also have 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens. And so what happens is the way the carbons and so forth are arranged is different between these different simple sugars, making them slightly different chemically. And when you have the exact same molecular formula but a different arrangement, that is referred to as isomers. So glucose, C6H12O6, is arranged as this lovely 5-carbon ring with an oxygen forming point of the ring, and then a carbon dioxide off to carbon and oxygen off to the side. Same sort of arrangement for galactose. However, the positions of the hydrogen and oxygen and hydrogen off of this carbon is different, making it slightly different chemically. And then fructose makes a 4-point ring, so only 4 points, of pentose shape with 4 carbons and an oxygen. So again, they are all the same by their molecular formula, but the isomers are distinct in how they're arranged and have slightly different chemical properties. All right, when you have bonding, covalent bonds, they can be polar or nonpolar. Nonpolar means that they are sharing the electrons equally between all the atoms, and so there's no partial charge within the molecule. So methane is nonpolar, carbon dioxide nonpolar, other things like glucose could be nonpolar. And then we have polar molecules from polar covalent bonds, and that means there's an uneven sharing of the electrons. So water is an example of a polar molecule. The hydrogen atoms are slightly positive because they do not get the electron for very long, while the oxygen is slightly negative because it keeps the electrons for the longest period of time. So again, slightly positive, slightly negative. The overall molecule has no net charge, but within the polar molecule, they are an uneven distribution of the electrons. So, covalent bonds are either polar or nonpolar. Triglycerides are an example of nonpolar molecules, very important in living things. Glucose, on the other hand, is a polar molecule. So correct my statement earlier. Glucose is a polar molecule. Triglycerides are nonpolar. Polar molecules are able to dissolve in water. That slight charge in the molecule allows it to dissolve in the slightly charged water environment. Turns out there are some molecules out there that are amphipathic. Amphipathic means that it has part of it that is polar and part of it that is nonpolar. So for instance, phospholipids, very important molecule found in our bodies, is amphipathic. It has a charged region where you find a phosphate group, and it has a non-polar region where you find fatty acid molecules. So the fatty acid molecules, not charged, non-polar region. The polar region where you have that phosphate group is charged. So polar region attracted to water, non-polar avoids water. There are some intramolecular attractions which are weaker than covalent bonds or ionic bonds. An example of this would be hydrogen bonding. Hydrogen bonding is a slight attraction between the positive hydrogen in a water molecule and the negative oxygen or negative nitrogen in some other molecule, so that the slightly positive hydrogen ions are attracted to the slightly negative oxygen or nitrogen parts of molecules, and that leads to hydrogen bonds. This is why things that are charged will dissolve in water, because they'll interact with that charge distribution in the water molecule. So water, for instance, can form 4 hydrogen bonds with other waters. This means that there's actually some tension, some strength in water just because of the hydrogen bonds to adjacent water molecules. Water has a lot of functions. It can transport things that's dissolved in the water all throughout the body. It can lubricate parts of the body to decrease friction. Friction can damage body structures. It can provide cushioning and absorb forces when the body's in motion. And it can be used to excrete waste, which is just another example of something dissolving in the water, but in that case to get eliminated. And as you can see, we are mostly water. About 60% for adults, 70% for childs. Turns out we dry out as we get older. Water's properties include cohesion, where water is attracted to other water through hydrogen bonding, and this can lead to surface tension, which allows water to try to hold together even when it's not being limited by other structures surrounding it. So you can put a lot of water droplets on a penny. Surface tension can cause delicate structures to collapse, but if you mix things like proteins and lipids into the water, it becomes a surfactant, which then gets rid of that surface tension. Also, adhesion, water can attract with other substances besides water, leading it to, say, climb up the charged glass of a pipette tube. And we're going to have to stop here.